Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this joint webinar between Cyera and ESG, a division of TechTarget. Today, we're going to be talking about how you can gain control of your hybrid IT data security. And I'm joined today by John Oltsik, a distinguished fellow and analyst with ESG.
Thanks, Ari. Nice to be here. And I'll just get into it. The title is Gaining Control of Hybrid IT Data Security. And note, we're saying hybrid IT. So we're not focused on the cloud. We're not focused on on-premise. We want to understand our data security across the environment. We want consistency of tooling, consistency of processing, consistency of oversight. And that's really a challenge, and that's what we'll talk about today. So let's first look at some opinions of cybersecurity professionals. Now, this is a recent survey data from a survey of 387 cybersecurity professionals, most of whom worked at enterprise organizations, which we define as 1,000 employees or more. So you see the headline, 92% believe cloud requires a data security evaluation. As it should, Ari. I mean, we should assess what we're doing in the cloud, what data is going to the cloud, what are the data flows of the cloud. And we should think holistically about what we're trying to do, what our business goal is, what our security requirements are, and then respond accordingly. Now, what we'll see in this research is that isn't always happening, and we'll talk a lot about that. 88% said the difference between on-premises and cloud resident infrastructure requires different sets of data security policies and technologies. My question is, are the technologies driving the policies? Do we have different tooling, which means we have to really accommodate our policies to the tools? Because we really should have consistent policies, regardless of where the data lives. That's, to me, as a business person, that's secondary. That's an IT concern. But if I have governance or I have compliance requirements, they should be consistent. I should be able to enforce those policies consistently. And then one other thing I'll point out, protecting our organization's cloud resident sensitive data has been a challenge. Boy, is that an understatement. That's what we'll talk about. We have a lot of data to really demonstrate that in this presentation. But Ari, is there anything here that I've talked about or haven't talked about that really stands out to you?
Well, I think you make some excellent points. One of the things that we hear quite consistently from security teams, both within our customers and with other peers in the industry, is that there used to be a more clear delineation of responsibilities when people were managing data on-prem, whether that meant in your own hosted data center, whether that meant in rented data center or colo space. There was an understanding of the business would devise how they wanted to go to market, how they wanted to engage their customers. IT would support their application environment. The security team would help with implementing controls and really keeping the business safe where those applications were meeting the outside world. Now, we know with zero trust, there's no more inside and outside, and that's been something that has been covered and discussed, and there's a myriad of architectural approaches to really think about that trust but verify sort of architectural evolution that the industry has gone through. But one of the things that is so interesting and so challenging about the cloud is just how permissive it is. And so when you try to adapt your on-prem processes, when you think about the technologies that were devised for an on-prem infrastructure, the challenge in the cloud becomes the ease with which a business team, a motivated employee, an analyst can start to spin up additional cloud infrastructure, whether that actually be infrastructure as a service, or it be a database as a service where you want to analyze data and flows and come up with new routes to market, new ways to open up revenue streams or engage with your customers. But then there's also SaaS where people are collaborating with a remote workforce. And so when you think about who owns which pieces of your data landscape and what is your threat surface as a security practitioner, the answer becomes very complex. And who manages each of those systems, who's responsible for the data, is in part defined by the shared responsibility model with cloud solution providers. It's in part defined by the organizational structure that you work within. But the reality is security practitioners are always adapting to understand where their data is, who has access to it, what that data represents, and what sort of exposures from a security and compliance perspective exist with that data, and how they can take action to remediate it while enabling the business and not disrupting it. And I think that's the part where the 92% are really weighing in, saying we have to evaluate how we are using cloud and how our governance needs to be adapted to this new normal of a really permissive and very broad data landscape.
Yeah, well said. And of course, the elephant in the room is that everything's changing very quickly. And so regardless of your assessment, it needs to be open-ended so that you can accommodate these different models and different data security needs.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, so on to some other data. 54% of those we surveyed said on-premises data security is more effective than cloud security. So this brings up a whole number of questions in my mind. I tend to ask a lot of questions anyway, but if on-premises data security is better than cloud security, well, first of all, how effective is that on-premises data security? Because fair is better than poor. And so we have to be really kind of cognizant of how well it is. And from all my experience, it's never been very good. It's always been a very big challenge for large organizations. But the second thing is, if it's more effective than cloud security, but we're moving data to the cloud, we're doing a lot of cloud native development, a lot of the key business applications, digital transformation applications are being developed in cloud and maybe even multi-cloud. Is this acceptable? Now, I'll put my CISO hat on. Absolutely not. So what do you think? Is this an imbalance here? Are we kind of looking at one environment and then another? And is that the right way to go?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you could think about the comparison as somewhat being nostalgic, looking at the days when you understood what was happening in your environment. You felt like the evolution was moving at a pace that was easier for you to react to. If somebody deployed a new architecture, in many ways, when it was on-prem, the organization knew about it. I mean, the pace of development, the release cycles, the way that you architected applications, it lended itself to a slower pace where everybody could align, or at least when you were reacting, that reaction time wasn't what it needs to be today. Now, there's the notion of the devil you know and the devil that you don't, and I think that's what causes people so much concern. And I don't know if frustration is the right word, but maybe it is just that concern, that worry that you don't know how much risk is compounding in an environment where you're scripting deployments, many of your releases are automated, people are able to include or create or consume more data with the JavaScripts that they would assemble at runtime in an application, with other employees, or even APIs that they would enable so that people can facilitate data sharing in real time once an application is deployed. And in that sense, you don't really understand at any given point in time how your application might evolve from day to day, from release to release. And in some cases where people are hyper agile in today's environment, you're doing multiple releases, tens of releases in some cases a day. And so what is that landscape? What data are you managing? How is it being exposed to additional risks? Those questions become harder and harder to answer. And I think the challenge is when people looked at on-premise data security, the idea was there was attestation that was reasonable to expect would be accurate or mostly comprehensive, if not completely comprehensive. Nowadays, point-in-time assessments of what sort of an architecture you have, what sort of data you have, and who can access it simply isn't appropriate for the cloud era. And as we move forward with automation and AI, and I'm not even talking about generative AI and all of the buzz around ChatGPT, but just artificial intelligence and machine learning in general, where you're allowing decisioning to go faster than humans would normally progress it, the challenge with the effectiveness of your controls simply becomes, are the controls appropriate for the current state when that current state is constantly evolving? And so that's where I think the survey responses here are in line with what we've heard from our customers, is in line with the way that we've seen a proliferation of XSPM, or security posture management tools, that have been developed for cloud, for SaaS, for applications, and for data, where people are looking at different ways to get their arms around the problem and control the elements of the architecture and the application stack that they understand the best and that they feel that they can secure most effectively.
Yeah, very well said. And I would just say, but in the on-premises world, we thought we knew where the data was. That wasn't always the case. Maybe in the cloud, we're admitting we really just don't know where the data is. And if that's the case, that is a good thing, because we want to address that. So now let's look at data criticality associated with the cloud. On the left, 77% of organizations say that they store sensitive data in one or more infrastructure as a service, platform as a service platform. So the data's there, the sensitive data. Now, sensitive data could be defined in lots of different ways. It could be compliance data. It could be internal data of some kind that we just happen to classify as sensitive. But on the right side, it really kind of clarifies what we're talking about. How would you rate the business criticality of the data in your organization's data lakes, data warehouses, and data lakes? So assuming those data lakes are on a cloud platform, which is very often the case these days, we see that 32% say that the data is they would classify the data as critical, and 64% say that they would classify that data as important. So business critical data is there, and it's being stored in the cloud on multiple CSPs. So this tells us we really need to do something about this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, if you think about what your implied value and your implied promise is with your customer or your constituents, whoever they are, it could be consumers, it could be patients, it could be providers across a network, it could be other partners that you work with. The data that they want is the valuable data, the data that's going to define value for you, your organization, your consumers, and your partners is by necessity going to be important or business relevant data. Now, the amount of value that represents to a business will vary. It'll vary by the type of application. It'll vary by the type of experience that you're creating. But the reality is, it's not like we're back in 1999 or 2003 when data loss prevention tools were created, when applications or websites were effectively brochures. Now we have composable architectures. We have just-in-time development and assembly of different experiences, and those have to be connected experience, highly personalized experiences, and the sorts of things that are providing people value in this hyper-competitive cloud world that we live in. And so by necessity, you're going to be having business-critical data that is going to be managed across clouds. Now, I mentioned before that we've seen a rise in security posture management approaches, technologies, tools, platforms. People are defining these things very differently, but the spaces are evolving very quickly, because when you think about it, you've got teams who are used to managing infrastructure, and they're used to looking at applications that run in an infrastructure and a workload that is going to be facilitated by those apps across that infrastructure. And that is essentially what CSPM and CNAP and CWPP as a part of it are all focused on managing, because you want to make sure that you understand how to create the most secure runtime environment for an application. And so that is where the CNAP platforms have risen to become very popular investment areas for CISOs and their teams. But when you think about the way that the business uses data, you could have a legitimate user who can access information the way that they should based on information governance guidelines in an AWS or a Microsoft Azure environment. But if they're pulling that information down into a data lake, then you might not know about it if you're narrowly focused on infrastructure as a service. Now, that's why CNAP platforms are starting to evolve to encapsulate also database as a service or platform as a service, because they understand that sort of very tightly coupled relationship, or increasingly tightly coupled relationship. And an evidence of that is if you look at Snowflake deployments for a data warehouse, those are very often hosted on AWS. And so it makes a lot of sense, for example, for people to look at those environments together. But when you look at SaaS, that has historically been the domain of IT. So you've got the security team really focusing with the infrastructure team on what you're running in your infrastructure as a service. But when it comes to SaaS, that's really more for collaboration. Historically, people would have thought those are my on-prem file shares, or the way that I'm sharing information in a closed environment, maybe on a VPN or a corporate network. But that's no longer the case. Now it's very easy for a team or an individual to spin up a demo account or just their own personal account on Box or on Slack or on any number of different collaboration platforms. And your data very easily can start to drift into those environments, because once it's left your controlled environment and you've got copies of it, let's say in a data warehouse, or you've downloaded something to a device, or maybe you've got it in your Microsoft 365 environment that is sanctioned by the organization, from there, the ability to start moving into other areas is a lot more permissive. It's a lot easier for that data to start drifting. And the challenge, I think, becomes how people have evolved their information governance guidelines and policies, but also the visibility, because technology providers and vendors have historically followed the sort of known knowns that they were going after. So if I need to secure infrastructure, then I'll develop tooling and I'll develop a product to do that. SaaS isn't part of my purview, therefore I don't extend to SaaS. Or I might say I'm only interested in managing the flow of unstructured data because that's where I'm really worried about data being transferred. Well, that's not going to cover any sort of structured data that might be put into a data warehouse or a data lakehouse. And so you really need to start thinking in the cloud era much more holistically, much more expansively, just about the absolutes in your environment. You've got data that you need to understand. You've got identities and access that you need to understand. And then you have applications and workloads that you need to know and understand. Each of those require specialized tools and specialized processes, but then also integrations so that you understand the interplay or the interconnected nature of those three levels of creating an application experience. And that is a lot of what Zero Trust was designed to be. You put data at the center of networks and applications and devices and users. But in this case, when we talk about the cloud, and if you want to keep the buzzwords out of it, you really just need to follow what are the major moving pieces and the areas where you could have accidental disclosures, misuse, or outright malicious activity across those three areas where you really need the depth to understand what steps you need to be taking so that you're enabling the business and not disrupting it. Because nowadays, control simply cannot stand in the way of the business.
Yeah, well said, Ari. And I want to underline something you just said and kind of put it in my own words. Cloud infrastructure is dynamic, but it is immobile. So a service on AWS is going to be a service on AWS, even if it's temporal. However, data is mobile. So if you can't follow the data, see where it goes, understand where it goes, understand who has access to it and what has access to it as it moves, then you don't have data security. And you just summarized that really well. Is all of these tools are great, but somehow you have to be able to capture the data flows within those. And that's why you need this specialization and to break down the silos, which we'll talk about. Okay, this is a little bit of an eye chart. Sorry to interrupt there, Ari, but the point here is greater than 30% of IaaS and PaaS data and SaaS data is exposed for the most part. Now, let me kind of look at this. On the bottom, you see the 33%. That is associated with SaaS data. And what organizations are saying is that at least 30% of their data, 33% of organizations say that at least 30% of their data is insufficiently secured in SaaS. Now, looking at the top, what that is saying is that 59% of organizations say at least 30% of the data that they store on infrastructure as a service or platform as a service is insufficiently secured. So everything we just talked about, and Ari, you talked about kind of the division of labor, and you talked about the different tools. That all assumes kind of best practices. What we're seeing here is a certain lack, an alarming lack of best practices, where if the data is insufficiently secured, it's vulnerable. it could be exposed and exploited very easily. So this is quite alarming to me. I put on my CISO hat, and I'd hate to bring this data to my board and my executives. So what's going on here, Ari?
Well, what I think we hear quite a lot is there's a challenge in education. There's a challenge in really people understanding when they're using data, what constitute, well, first of all, what security controls should be in place and why do those need to exist? Because if you look at the CISO, if you look at the whole security operations team, they're trained and certified in understanding what creates risk, what compounds risk, and how to manage that risk. And there's all sorts of different ways to look at it. There's NIST, there's the MITRE ATT&CK framework, there's different frameworks that you can follow and different approaches that people take so that they can apply some sort of risk management and risk measurement to the business. When you go into a business unit, whether it's a project manager, a developer, a marketer, a product manager, all of those types of people will understand their disciplines very deeply, and they're incentivized to go out and meet the market to create tools and experiences that are differentiated and competitive in the marketplace. And that requires arguably a different set of considerations and goals to what the security team is really holding themselves accountable to. And so if you think about where people are feeling this exposure, where you see the 41 to 50% being very pronounced in IaaS and PaaS environments, but just generally speaking, this feeling of our data is exposed, you think about this idea of, do people in an organization between the CTO, the CIO, and the CSO really understand what data might be in scope for a project? That project could be anything from an application that you're launching. It could be a data-driven exercise to evaluate the business and develop a strategy going forward. It could be a merger and acquisition where you're trying to understand how two businesses could complement each other. And then, as you're going through the diligence, really understand, is there alignment here? What sorts of new opportunities are we going to be creating for ourselves if we do actually merge these two entities together? Those types of things will create a lot of exhaust, a lot of data exhaust, but there are also different pieces of information that have to be combined together and leveraged by those various teams so that they can perform their diligence. Part of the challenge with that is, where does that end up getting stored? How long is it going to be managed? Is it managed in a way that is commensurate with your information governance guidelines? Do you even have them for some of these activities? And have you educated your teams and gone back and retrained them and evaluated and done some spot testing, or you could say secret shopping, but it's not really appropriate for this sort of a workflow, but something where you're trying to see, do people understand the processes that they should follow and the controls that should be put in place? And I mentioned ChatGPT before, now I'll bring it up in this context. If you think about what concerns business leaders the most about the risk that is present in their environment from technologies like ChatGPT or other generative AI platforms, it's the fact that people may not know where they're exposing the business to risk by taking data and exposing it to those models. And I don't want to suggest that banning things is appropriate, or that, oh my God, they're going to map out all of the data across your entire environment. But the reality is, people don't necessarily know when they're running afoul of a privacy statute or of a data governance initiative, or where they're exposing IP secrets to a training set of data or to data analysts in a way that they shouldn't. And that, I think, is the grand challenge today, where businesses have to keep moving this quickly. And there really isn't an established framework for training business people the way that you would train security practitioners. And so you run hot when it comes to this sort of risk in the cloud.
Very true. So this is about data loss. We've talked about exposed data. We've talked about some of the challenges, and we'll get more into that. But 33% of organizations say that they've lost cloud resident sensitive data. So they've been breached. They've had either a malicious or a neglectful type of attack. That's pretty scary too. But when we say, well, what of these factors contributed to your organization's loss of cloud resident sensitive data? So misconfigurations of SaaS services could be things like overly permissive accounts, could be too many administrator accounts, could be the use of simple passwords, no MFA. So lots of reasons that you'd be exposed there. Data exposure from data misclassification. Now, all right, I see this all the time. Data classification is difficult. It has been in the past because it was sort of static. You needed a governance model to guide it, and then you needed the right controls to actually enforce the classification models. But misclassified data, very common, especially when data is transferred, the transfer of ownership from person to person or from application to application. Similar to the first one, 32% say misconfiguration of an IaaS or PaaS service. We're seeing a lot of API misconfigurations. Of course, there's always the open S3 buckets that we talk about. But one other point I'd like to make is malicious insider, 31%. So that's right. These are all pretty close to each other within a margin of error from each other. You have to be able to protect your data from malicious insiders. We've seen things like the Edward Snowden attack and the Bradley Manning attack going back a few years, where sensitive data was not only exposed to a malicious insider, but they used it for malicious purposes and causing organizations, in this case, the US military, the NSA, tremendous damage. So there's a lot of ways you can get this wrong, Ari, and I'm just wondering, what's the pattern that you see?
Well, I think it's interesting because if you follow this from the top down, you're sort of looking at misconfiguration of SaaS services as a proliferation of the most cloud services across an organization. So people are using anything from Salesforce to manage their customer relationships. They're using OneDrives or SharePoints or Google productivity suites to share information across the organization, but then maybe with partners or consultants. You've got misclassification that occurs, to your point, I don't think maliciously, but certainly there's an institutional knowledge that could go into creating some form of data tagging or metadata in the first place when something is created. You mentioned the S3 bucket. You consider a very common architectural paradigm of, I have a web application, I want to put, let's say, non-classified or public information into a bucket to make it really easy for somebody to gain access to from the website. That's a very common design pattern. Well, the challenge becomes, first and foremost, there could be a system that doesn't understand the sensitivity of the data. Maybe the tags are missing, and so you're going to see that very noisy alert of, you've got an S3 bucket exposed to the public internet. If a security practitioner actions that alert, then you all of a sudden have a business user that gets an alert that says the website's broken, nobody can access the information that they need. They would go to IT because that's who's managing their application environment. IT would say, well, I see the problem right here. Somebody removed the public link or the public exposure. They will reinstate that configuration. The alert goes back to the security team and the cycle continues. And we talk to people, and that is a very common challenge inside of an organization. It's also one that gets probably overused when we talk about cloud data. But more realistically, if you just think about how applications can naturally evolve, you might initially create an experience where the only information that you would put in one of those buckets is non-classified or very public information. But then let's say over time, you start to create customer specific information, and the developer says, well, I've got an S3 bucket that's right there, and the application already has a workflow where it knows how to go to that bucket and extract information to share with the user. So once they're logged in, I can put that information in the same bucket, and I've already got a treatment for how to serve information up to a user from my website. The challenge is, the cloud tag may say that it's public information, but now it's not. Now maybe it's internal, or maybe it's altogether confidential information, depending on what that login was supposed to house or protect. And people don't necessarily understand within the organization. The developer may not know, or the product manager that's designing the feature may not know that they have to apply a different tag now that they have more sensitive data there, and apply a different set of controls. Because at the end of the day, you want the application to be performant. You're trying to get your application developed and deployed as quickly as you want to or you can. And so therefore, those sorts of mistakes happen. That could be completely an accidental misconfiguration, But when the data leaves, and it still constitutes a breach. Now, you mentioned malicious users. Famously, there was, I think, the incident that brought the shared security model and a well-architected framework to the top of people's consciousness, and that was when Capital One had that issue that occurred on AWS, and there was a lot of conjecture around, was this a malicious activity or was it a misconfiguration and an accident? Who was responsible? But at the end of the day, the point is the business is responsible for understanding what data they have and for securing it when it's being managed in the cloud. And you cannot rely on attestation and human effort when you're moving at the pace that the cloud is evolving to define what your data classification is for your security apparatus to control the flow of that data. And that's where, if you look at misconfiguration of IaaS and PaaS as another concern, those three things together constitute the majority of public or consumer facing application workloads, and where a lot of your data, and we saw that on a prior slide with those pie charts, a lot of your sensitive data is going to be exposed that way. And so I think, people will make a lot of the malicious insiders and really wanting to control that, or external attackers. But I think more often than not, the majority of the challenges that businesses face is really just understanding those 5 questions that I mentioned before. And it's really, what data do I have? And ultimately, if I go all the way down, what's exposing it to risk and how do I remediate it in a way that is going to allow the business to continue to evolve, especially when security teams are not application architects. They're not necessarily steeped in the rhythms of the business, because they are goaled and managed and incentivized to focus on a different aspect, and that's the security and the control. And so you do have that sort of tug of war, but also the challenge where you have distributed ownership and, unfortunately, technology and tools that keep your visibility very siloed.
Yeah, and I'll just add that misconfiguration of SaaS or IaaS or PaaS services and data exposure is going to open an avenue for a malicious insider. So it all goes together. All right, the question here is, what are the most significant cloud data security challenges for your organization? And you see by the headline, it really hints at what the data says. So detecting and stopping data breaches in real time. So this is beyond prevention. Will we be able to detect an attack? Will we be able to understand an alert that comes in? Will that alert require us to escalate an alert or an incident, or really get a number of people involved? So in real time is kind of the key, because as we know from historical data, detecting data breaches can be weeks, months, even years of time. Obviously, we don't want that. So detecting cloud data breaches in real time is something that is a big challenge. Understanding the specifics of how our cloud service providers and our organization share responsibility for securing our cloud resident data. So this speaks to the shared responsibility model. Google calls it a shared fate model. They go a little bit further with their protections and their templates for how you deploy an application. But this really is the responsibility of the security team and the organization to understand really what the application is, what the data is, where it is, what services are there, how I can use the logging of those services. So if there's a misunderstanding there, that's a fundamental problem to me. And this is something we've discussed a lot, Ari, is data lineage. So the map of the data journey, its origin, each stop, an explanation of how and why the data has moved over time. This is where organizations get it really wrong. Because as I mentioned, data is mobile, it changes, it's used in different ways. And if it's sensitive, that has to be tracked, even when there are changes, even when we believe there are controls in place. And obviously that's a big challenge in the cloud, because not only are we dealing with multiple service and ephemeral services, we're dealing with multiple clouds. So Ari, is there anything I missed here? We want to talk about some of the other things.
I don't think you missed anything. I mean, it's interesting to see all of the topics that we've been talking about so far coming together in the data. But when I think about this notion of detecting and stopping data breaches in real time, yes, that is a critical capability. It's why we have security operations centers and why people are looking for indicators of compromise all the time. But if we look at the data from the 2022 IBM report on data breaches, the average time to detect an attack or a malicious activity, and you mentioned it yourself, is about 277 days or 9 months. So the first thing that businesses really, they already have been investing in it. Security teams have been championing this idea for a long time, but it's been a very difficult thing in the cloud to adapt to the permissiveness and the pace of cloud, and that's proactive control. People don't really, it's not as sexy a term or as sexy as an approach to think about, I'm going to put in place the insurance policy that is going to be the zero trust approach, the trust but verify, the ensuring that I have the minimal access to my sensitive data, that I know that it's only flowing between, east-west components of my network where it should and where it's justified for my workload, that anytime that I transit the data, I'm really paying attention to how that data needs to either be transformed or obfuscated or otherwise protected, so that the wrong people don't have access to it. And again, not even for a malicious purpose, just thinking about, risk for a business. If you think about risk and you think about data lineage, there's three ways that it can cut across a business. There's this notion of if the concern about data lineage is that my data changes and that I don't understand how it changed or who changed it, and I start to make decisions based on data without understanding those changes, I could be compounding risk for my business by making decisions on bad data, and I don't know that it's bad data. So that constitutes a material risk to the business, where you might be, driving a strategy based on data that was changed in a way that you didn't understand. You could consider it from a governance perspective, where you have drift. This is like a data sovereignty and a data residency challenge. GDPR is famous for, if you move data for an EU citizen or for a citizen of a given country in the EU outside of where that data originated, it constitutes a pretty hefty fine for the business. But it's not just GDPR. I mean, CCPA and LGPD, and there's other sort of privacy statutes here that are trying to explain and control how data is governed within an organization to keep individuals' privacy championed by the organization, so that you can maintain that trust with people, but also so that you're not exposing something that an individual was trusting you with. And then from a security perspective, there's the more obvious one potentially, and that's just, as data moves across environments, it is exposed to more security risk. And that's anything from, if you think about business email compromise and what an executive might have access to, you really want to understand what that is in case somebody clicks on, the wrong thing in an email or scans the wrong QR code, and suddenly their device or their account gets compromised, and now they have privileged access to very sensitive information across an organization. Or you think about how malware may make it onto a device, through BYOD, and you connecting to, non-secure networks, or maybe you plug something into your device while you were outside of a corporate environment and they don't have the right controls in place for an endpoint, but that can introduce malware into an organization as well. And so anyway, the way that you think about how this risk can compound and how it can impact different aspects of your business, the proactive controls are arguably the most important ones that you can put in place, so that when you are detecting things in real time, so that when you're looking at data lineage, you understand that at least you have a baseline of protections in place. And then you really are detecting things that you haven't already accounted for. And that, to me, goes back to the beginning of the data that you were showing, where people are challenged to assess just how exposed they are in the cloud, because they don't necessarily understand what their footprint in the cloud is on a day-to-day basis, or even in some cases, if you want to go to extremes of agility, on an hour-by-hour basis.
Yeah, that's all true. One other thing I'd say here, though, is that 28% said general organizational knowledge of cybersecurity threats that pose a risk to our data assets. I would just encourage people to get to know the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and especially the MITRE ATT&CK framework for cloud, because that will give you an adversary perspective, and maybe that will help you understand the threats a little bit better. Okay, so what are you going to do about this? So how does your organization prefer to consume data security tools? And what we see is that 2/3 say that they prefer to consume data security tools as a comprehensive integrated data security platform. like DSPM, and then 32% as a set of individual tools. Now, editorially, I'm going to say that 32%, I would imagine that's an immature audience and they are consuming things individually because they're getting started and they're layering these things on top of each other. What we see in mature organizations, not only in data security, but across the board with security, is the notion of rationalizing their portfolios and their technology stacks, their security technology stacks. And they want integrated solutions. So all of these point tools over time are being integrated into bigger platforms. So it doesn't surprise me at all that 2/3 want to consume this as a data security platform. And Ari, I would imagine what they really want is something that can cover on-premises environment, multi-cloud environments, and SaaS environments.
I think that's right. And I think it's interesting because, you used a term that I think gets used quite a lot in the technology space, and that's an integrated set of tools. And I think that integration is a real challenge, especially as organizations grow and their portfolios expand. Because every company starts off being really expert in one area. There's always the eponymous thing that a company builds that is in their wheelhouse, that is their area of expertise, and that's how they get started and they grow. And then naturally, in order to provide ways to expand their value to their customers, but also to grow the value of their customers to them, they'll expand their portfolios, sometimes organically through development, other times through acquisition. I would argue acquisitions are more common, especially as organizations get to a certain size and scale. But then that integration becomes a challenge. And that's what's really frustrating for practitioners when they say, my platform offers me all of these capabilities. However, some of them are truly integrated together. Others are maybe integrated through a UI, or I can integrate them through a lot of manual effort and professional services. But I think more and more when we think about the cloud, this notion of a converged architecture or a converged set of systems that can actually cooperate with one another is going to become the more accepted approach and the more practical one for businesses who are assembling the right architecture for them, for their business. If you think about, as an example, you mentioned DSPM. DSPM is a nascent but quickly evolving and quickly maturing market, owing to this challenge that companies have really understanding their data and securing it. But it is a component of a larger whole. And we've seen some of the acquisitions of IBM with Polar. We've seen Laminar being snapped up by Rubrik, focusing on data retention and how you really think about managing your data throughout its life cycle, but with more of a slant towards how am I protecting my data versus securing it. And there's a nuance there in the terms. And then you think about the CSPMs who are saying, look, I have this infrastructure security play that is moving into database or platform as a service, and it needs knowledge of data. And so, just today, as we're recording this webinar, we saw that Palo Alto announced the acquisition of Dig Security. And so you're seeing DSPM being added to different portfolios and different platforms in order to provide a more expansive value and arguably to inject some knowledge of data into existing workflows. Where I think we've heard from practitioners and from business leaders that they'd like to see a much stronger focus from technology organizations is this idea of a converged and integrated architecture that they can compose based on their needs. So they can select the best of breeds where appropriate. They can select the mega platforms where appropriate, but they have a way to actually integrate them together so that they cooperate. And that's where, if you look at DLP as an example, the challenge with DLP isn't that it wasn't appropriate for the on-prem world that it was designed for back in 2003. The challenge is 20 years on, the architectures have changed, the pace of development has changed, and all of the data security platforms that are focused on manually connecting to data stores, maintaining user accounts, permeating or poking holes in the network so that you can actually gain access to data stores through a unified central management tool or platform, those things are running afoul of zero trust in the pace of cloud. And so instead, if you can take a cloud native approach in our cloud era today, and then say, how does the knowledge and protection and proactive nature of securing my data complement the existing tools and the training and all of the processes that I've built up in my organization, then you can create a much stronger and more effective converged security architecture. And that's where I think, we'll talk about it in a moment, but when people really think about budget cycles and planning as they mature through their information governance programs, that's where they need the flexibility to say, I'm going to use the right tool that I know about right now, but as new entrants and new approaches emerge, I need the flexibility to start layering on the appropriate controls so that I can figure out where platforms exist the way that I need them versus where I need to go to a best of breed solution.
Yeah, and flexibility is key, but also understanding, at least as best as you can, the strategic needs that you'll have over the next 18 months, 36 months, etc. So 87% of organizations plan to increase data security spending. That tells me something. So first of all, that this research was conducted during the last 6 months. So respondents had absolute visibility into the economic uncertainty in the world's economy, the high interest rates and the cost of money being high. But they still said, 87% of organizations still said, yes, we will increase our data security spending. So that tells me that they recognize some of the challenges that we saw. They may assess what they have and they see a gap and they need to spend accordingly.
Completely agree. And I don't have much to add on this one because I think the next slide actually summarizes where that's heading pretty well.
Yeah, good setup. So which of the following tasks would be your highest priorities for your organization to implement and protect cloud resident sensitive data? So we're spending money. We've discussed a lot of the challenges, a lot of the gaps here. These are the things that people talk about. And the headline says really is a headline here: holistic data security with a cloud-first approach. 35% said build a cloud security strategy that can be used to secure sensitive data across heterogeneous public and private cloud environments. So that's getting to that hybrid IT kind of notion that I described before. 31% said explore and implement new security technologies that are specifically designed to protect cloud resident sensitive data. And Ari, when I talk to CISOs, I always tell them, be open-minded, cast a wide net. There's a lot of innovation here, and you really do need to work with a company, not that just happens to have this functionality, but who really understands the cloud, understands the use cases for the cloud. It's not just a security perspective. It's not just blocking or denying or allowing access. And then 29% said learn about the security controls, monitoring capabilities, and APIs associated with each cloud service provider offering. Absolutely critical. And I would just add to that, don't just learn about it, keep learning, because the cloud is a dynamic environment. We're a couple of weeks away from reInvent, the AWS show, and they're going to announce a lot of new services. Developers will be playing with those services at the conference. So it's contingent upon the security team to know what's going on, to anticipate some of those changes, and then look for the proper security controls, the proper security oversight. So Ari, what's your conclusion here?
So I think this is a great slide because it brings together a lot of what we spoke about from the beginning of our conversation, which was that 54% of respondents to the survey felt that they were more secure on-prem than in the cloud. And so here I think you're going to a question of prioritization. Where do you feel that you've got the most unmanaged or unmitigated risk for your organization? And most would agree, and the survey data reflects it, that that is in the cloud. And pursuing something that focuses on the connective tissue and the enabler for the cloud era, which is an API-centric approach versus a network-centric approach, is critical to actually enable that composable architecture and that composable security framework in the cloud. And so if you're thinking about how do you build an approach, how do you start experimenting with emerging technologies, but then also how do you explore and implement the right solution that can go across structured and unstructured data, the different deployment models of cloud, go outside of the remit of however your individual cloud provider might be providing you tools to secure the data. You want to take advantage of what they have and the tools that they make available, but you don't want to have your security approach for AWS, your security approach for Azure, your security approach for Office 365. You really need a consistent framework and a consistent set of tooling that will show you how your data is distributed, who's accessing it where, and where they're moving that data to, and what sorts of activities are exposing you to security and compliance risks so that you can take action effectively. And that's where I think we see that the ability to look across your clouds and focus on a cloud native approach, and then to apply that sort of an approach to your on-prem data and environments as you mature and start to establish that more homogeneous approach across your cloud data landscape, that will afford the industry time to catch up with how the different capabilities need to evolve and what the required basic capabilities are for a sort of composable security architecture in the cloud. But it'll also allow you to really focus on where you have the most unmanaged or the greatest risk to your business, which arguably, according to all the data that we just saw, is in the cloud. And so I think that's why when people are looking at evaluating vendors today, the most important thing that they can really focus on is, what is my priority today based on the risk that I need to manage? And then how can I create a roadmap to eventually get to that sort of a platform approach that people say that they would like to procure and manage, because it is a much simpler way to manage their data estate and their security exposures. But you have to prioritize and you have to crawl, walk, run to get there. And I think this is a great slide that highlights a way that businesses can think about that evolution.
That's great. Well, Ari, I appreciate the time. I appreciate you getting me involved in this. And I'll just end with this. I love the expression, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. With data security, everything's not a nail. Don't think that everything's a nail. And therefore, you need the right tooling. You need to understand the challenges, and you have to apply, like we talked about, a holistic approach. So with that bit of wisdom, Ari, thanks. What's your conclusion?
I completely agree. No, I think this was a great discussion. The data was fantastic. And I really hope that the audience gets a lot out of the information that you provided here and some of the color commentary. But this is a real pleasure, John. I thank you so much for joining us here for this webinar today. And for all of you, thanks for joining us and listening in. Take care, everybody.